Hi, everybody. This is Quinn, and welcome back to the second segment of Tell Me Your Story. Last week, I interviewed Sarah Nichols, who's the director at Carnegie Public Library, and this week, well, it's kind of hard to find somebody to interview when we're in the middle of this stay-at-home quarantine, and people don't like to get out and get out in public. So I'm going to tell you my story of how I got involved and interested in reading. A few things about my favorite authors. And so I like to begin by telling you that when I was little, I was so fortunate to be raised in a household of readers. Both my mother and father were big readers. We always had a ton of books around the house. My older sister Margaret was a big reader, and she was always gracious enough to read to me whatever she was reading at the time. My mother loved Old Mother West Wind by Thornton Burgess. You don't see this very often. It's not commonly read anymore. My mother had it read to her when she was a child in the 30s, and Mom read it to me in the 60s. And it's a kind of an old-fashioned book. It's about Old Mother West Wind and her children, the merry little breezes, and about all the animals of the woods. And it's a gentle read. But you learn about the characteristics of animals, and it's just so sweet. And Mother read this to us constantly. I fell in love with it, and I'd like for people to try to experiment. It is an old-fashioned type of book. It's not flashy like a lot of the picture books are today, but it's a dear one, and I loved it growing up. My mom also read to us Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories. And so we were introduced to a very foreign, exotic locales and animals. And those were very special books for me, too. Mom was a big reader of reading to my sister and I in the afternoon. She wasn't a huge proponent of bedtime reading. It's like bedtime is bedtime. So she read a lot to us in the afternoon. And I have very fond memories of my father reading the comics to my sister and I growing up. And before church every Sunday, we would sit on either side of his big leather armchair, and he would read the comics to us. And I admit I got a little impatient because he would read every single comic, and who cared about Judge Parker or Mary Worth? I wanted to get to the funny ones like Snuppy Smith and Dagwood. So, but he would read every single comic out loud to Margaret and I. So our house was filled with books. We moved around a lot when I was a child, and when we would move to a new community, there were two things that we always did. Mom and Daddy would find a new church family for us to go to belong to, and Mom would take us to the library, and we would get our library cards. And that was just, we knew that within the first week of moving to a new town, those two things were going to be accomplished. So we had a lot of books either that we owned at home or that we would borrow from the library. Another thing that really influenced my reading is that I was fortunate enough that my parents loved magazines and subscribed to a lot. And back in the 60s, there were a couple of magazines called Look and Life, and they were very oversized and very large, and they were known for the exquisite photography and pictures of current events, famous people, and we would get them weekly. And I remember loving to run to the mailbox and getting these lush, beautiful magazines. And you go to a garage sale today, you could often see these magazines bundled up, and I will often buy them because they're just really terrific magazines. My parents always subscribed to National Geographic. In fact, my 90-year-old mother still subscribes to National Geographic. And that's a delight for children to be able to go through that and go through all those exquisite pictures that National Geographic is known for. And we also subscribe to Saturday Evening Post, U.S. News World Report. My father was a scientist, so we always got Scientific American. And Reader's Digest, loved that. I used to always like to read the jokes in Reader's Digest. And my mother always subscribed to Ladies' Home Journal. So we had this big variety of magazines that would come to our house every week. And long before I could even read, I had the luxury of just having access to these wonderful magazines with wonderful pictures, and that would ignite my imagination. And even just by looking at pictures, it gives you a frame of reference to help you understand things about space, the deep ocean, the wild, wild west, something that's going over and happening in Asia or Europe. So looking at pictures is very important as you are learning to acquire those pre-literacy skills. So I didn't really jump into reading until the 4th grade, and I quickly went through a series of Bobbsey twin books were a big favorite. Then I jumped into Boxcar Children, and then my all-time favorite was Trixie Belden and her gang of friends, and they traveled all around the United States solving mysteries. And I used to always wonder, how can a bunch of 12, 13, and 14-year-old kids travel around the United States without their parents and go to these exotic locales and solve these mysteries? It was just a mysterious, wonderful world, and I loved Trixie Belden. So I was definitely addicted to that series. My sister and I, by the time I was in 4th grade, we were allowed to go to the public library by ourselves. And I grew up in a small town in the Mississippi Delta. And my sister and I would ride our bikes up to the library and prop our bikes up against the side of it. And it was just one room, because it was a small library in a very small town. And I remember there were only 2 librarians. I won't say their names because maybe one of them is still alive. But I can tell you neither one of them were very friendly to children. They had their favorites and they liked the adults, but when kids would enter the library, you could just see a frown start over their face, and they couldn't wait to shush you. And so when I became a children's librarian, I made it a point that I was going to be the fun librarian, that we could laugh, that you didn't have to be quiet in the children's part of the library, and that you could have fun. And I do have those remembrances of these 2 ladies, though, being quite the cranky librarians. So I hate to say that about my own profession, but over the years, I've run into quite a few cranky librarians. And I sometimes wonder if people were mistaken when they entered the librarianship field, that they thought that they could be isolated and away from people and just stay immersed in books. And sadly, unless you're a cataloger or you are an archivist or work in special collections, working in a library is a very public, customer service related field. So you may love books, you may like the solitary life, but to be a successful librarian, you need to be able to enjoy the public and be able to serve them and welcome them to the library. Unlike these 2 cranky librarians that waited on me when I was a kid. What else? I remember some pretty cranky school librarians too. But I must say that I've come across some fabulous public school librarians. They're my colleagues in the community. I've worked closely with Beth Keller, who recently retired from Bel Air, and I also remember working with Chrissy Cooper, who's the librarian at Miami Trace Elementary School. And I can tell you that both of these ladies are a lot of fun. The kids love them, and they're very fun-loving with children. So, and I also would like to give a shout-out to Mary Lorraine Davis, who is on our library board. She was a middle school librarian, and I can only imagine that Mary Lorraine was the sweetest, the nicest, the friendliest librarian ever, working with kids. So yes, wonderful influences in our life. I like to tell kids when they're trying to pick out a book to read, to give it a chance. You need to be able to read at least 5 or 10 pages before you decide whether you're going to like it or not. And when I talk to people, some people have the 50-page rule or the 20-page rule. I'm a little tougher on authors. If you haven't captured me or captivated me by page 10, then I'm probably going to toss you aside and reach for a new book. I can often tell on page 1 or page 2 whether I'm going to like that book or not. And it seems unbelievable to me when I talk to people that say once they start a book, they feel compelled to read it to the very end. I never feel that. If I don't like it and if I'm not enjoying it, I'm going to toss this book aside in about 20 pages. I also am one of those readers that people can't believe that as a librarian I would do this, but I often sneak to the end of the book and see how it ends. I'll read like maybe the first 50 pages or 100 pages, and then I'm just so dying with curiosity that I got to know how it ends. Does it end well? Is it is the main character going to live or die? And so I'll sneak to the end, read the last 5 or 10 pages, and that doesn't ruin it for me. For a lot of people, it says it ruins the book, and what's the point? I actually can start to relax a little bit and enjoy the book a little bit more if I know everything's going to be okay. So that's a little odd habit I have of racing ahead and seeing what the action is. A favorite author of mine is Herman Wouk. He wrote Marjorie Morningstar, The Caine Mutiny, War and Remembrance, Winds of War, and many, many other books. Unbelievably, Herman Wouk is still alive, and he'll be turning 105, I believe, in May of this year. He had a profound influence on my reading, and I discovered him strictly out of boredom. There was a book on the shelf in my parents' library, and it was called The Caine Mutiny. And one day I was bored, didn't have anything to read, so I pulled that book off the shelf. And this is a book about World War II. The men are on a minesweeper in the Pacific Theater, and it's about all what happens in the middle of a war on a minesweeper. And it takes you through the sailors' training, and it takes you all around the world, actually, from Hawaii to all the islands in the Pacific Theater. And I was captivated by this book. And can you only imagine, for a 15-year-old girl who's only a sophomore in high school, what could be so interesting about a minesweeper during World War II? Well, that book, the way Herman Wouk wrote, pulled me into the story, made me care about the characters, made me want to keep turning the pages. And I can remember caring and thinking more deeply about World War II. At the age of 15, I knew all about World War II. Well, no, I knew as much as a 15-year-old does know about World War II through stories my father had told us because he served in the war, and basically, though, through history books. And so I knew dry facts. I knew some dates and some places and some people that were involved with it, but it was pretty much just cut and dry, an event that happened in American history. And when I opened this book and I read it, it took me to a different dimension. And it was very eye-opening to me that I suddenly felt like what that was like to be scared, to be frightened, to be pulled into the war, to serve with people you couldn't stand or people that you loved and cared for, about romances back in the United States and missing the ones that you love, about parents that are so concerned about their child serving in the war. It made me feel so many different emotions, and he just wrote the perfect story that I thought, this is a masterful storyteller. And I have found all of Herman Wouk's books to be that way, that he puts me into this place in time, and I can feel it, and I can smell it, and I can taste it, and that is a great storyteller. And that's what I want everybody to have, that opportunity to experience those things. I love biographies, and I have always loved biographies, and I would like to encourage children to read more biographies. And people always think they're dry and they're dull. Well, that's because you probably have read a dry and dull biography. And like with anything else, if it's dry and dull, I'm not interested in it either, and I toss it aside. But 3 books that I read as a child that I just thought were terrific was Florence Nightingale. Whatever, I don't remember anymore who the author was, but her tale telling of the life of Florence Nightingale was magical to me. Madame Curie, that author made Madame Curie come alive for me. And this is the really unbelievable selection. I had to do, in the 4th grade, a biography on a sports figure. And this is one of those had-to required lists, and I did mine on Frank Gifford. And if you know anything about me, I give 2 hoots about sports, and particularly 2 hoots about football. But I was mesmerized by the life of Frank Gifford and his triumphs and his defeats, and what it was like to be a young man as a football player that became nationally known. And I remember thinking, wow, I'm actually interested in this sports book. Again, I attribute that to great writing. We have a wonderful selection of children's biographies at Carnegie Public Library. We have the juvenile novels, juvenile biographies, which are appropriate for like 3rd grade and above. But we also have outstanding picture books on what we call biographies for the preschool, kindergarten, 1st or 2nd grade, and under every subject under the sun. And some unusual selections too, not just your presidents. But people say, well, why? What is it about a biography that you find interesting? And I think the thing that I love about them is that there are these people that have made a significant contribution to history, to humankind, in the world of politics, in the world of medicine, in every aspect of life. But they're also very flawed individuals. And they have let themselves down. They've let other people down. They might have even done terrible things in contrast with the wonderful things that they have done. They've suffered terrible defeats. And what amazes me about these individuals is that no matter how big of a defeat or hurt that they encountered, they rose above it. That somehow they did not let that bad event in their life pull them down and paralyze them, that they pulled ahead. And that's what inspires me about reading a really terrific biography. I like to see these terribly, terribly flawed human beings and what they can accomplish. And something that I've read in the last year or two that I just loved were some biographies on Winston Churchill. And you always hear about him being the great lion of the 20th century. He got his country, England, and the whole world practically through World War II. And yet he was a deeply, deeply flawed man. And he had suffered terrible defeats in his political life and his personal life, and he rose above it. And oh my gosh, did I love reading the Winston Churchill biography. Something that I've read lately, it was a biography on the first 100 days of Harry Truman's presidency. And of all the presidents that we've had, his first 100 days were more unique and more stressful and more world-changing events occurred in his first 100 days. He became president when Franklin Roosevelt died in April of 1945. So he led America through the end of World War II with Germany, and later in August concluded the war with Japan. And he was the one that decided we were going to use the atomic bomb. And it sounds like, and it could have been, by a different author, it could have been dreadfully dull, a dreadfully boring story of just a recitation of facts. But I'm sorry I don't remember the author's name, and I just read it about 2 or 3 months ago. But I was fascinated by those first 100 days of Harry Truman. And it was masterfully written, and it took a man that had experienced tremendous failure in his life. His farm failed, his store failed. He was sort of late in middle age before his career took off as a politician. Harry Truman had had a lot of defeats and disappointments in his life, but boy, did he rise to greatness when the world needed him. So, again, I love biographies, and I'd like to encourage you to explore them yourself and encourage your children to read them. Select them when you come to the library, and I would love to help you out with that. So these are some of the things that I would like to learn about from you. Librarians are endlessly interested in what other people are reading. I could sit in an airport, in a train terminal, and a bus station, and I look around and I see what other people are reading. And depending on what they're reading, I may engage in a conversation with somebody. I like to learn about what influenced them as a child. And I always like to hear a funny story about a librarian, because there's a lot of funny stories out there. And coming to the library, and I'll share some of my more scandalous stories that I know about some of the librarians where I grew up, and the funny, outrageous things they did. So the library is closed right now. We will be opening up in about a week to 2 weeks. I can tell you that all the staff members are looking forward to opening up our doors. We're ready to welcome all of you back into the library. I want to hear about what you've read during the past 6 weeks to 2 months. This is a stack of books that I've read. They're all juvenile novels. And I have to say they were all all terrific, and they cover a wide range of topics and subjects. And this is going to make me better at Reader's Advisory. So when you come in, I can tell you more about these terrific books that I've read, and maybe motivate your child to pick up one of these and discover something new about the world. So again, I'll be calling. I've got a few people I know right off the bat that I really want to hear from. I want to hear about their reading life. And so if I give you a call, I hope you would like to share your reading experiences with me. If you would like to share a story, call me at the library, and I would love to arrange a time to meet with you, and let's talk books and tell me your story. Thank you. See you soon. Bye-bye.